Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje eu estou aqui com o Benjamin Raffield, que vai nos falar um pouco, né, sobre os tópicos que ele pesquisa. Ele é pesquisador da Universidade de Uppsala. Alguns desses tópicos têm a ver com marcialidade na era viking, questão processos de escravidão dentro da era viking, e tem muitos desses assuntos que são bem interessantes para a gente abordar novamente e trazer até com um pouco mais de profundidade para conhecer esse outro lado também. Mr. Raffield, thank you so much for being here in the Viking World channel. It's a major pleasure receiving you here. So, how did you start your interest for research about the Viking Age and some talks related, like the martial period in the Viking Age, about slavery in the Viking Age? How start your interest for that?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me here. It's really, really great to be on. We all have different ways of getting into the Viking Age, don't we? And I mean, for me, I trained as an archaeologist at university. And what I went there to study in the first place was conflict archaeology. I was quite interested in the archaeology of warfare, battlefields, and all that kind of thing. And it was actually while trying to come up with a dissertation topic, I actually just started thinking about the Viking Age and the kinds of stereotypes we have about these people that we so often call the Vikings. And how they're presented in both the popular and the historical imagination. They're associated with warfare, associated with violence. And I actually just wanted to start trying to kind of dig into that, really, kind of try and get underneath these stereotypes, and try and understand these groups that are moving around Europe and of course having a much wider impact throughout the Viking Age. I mean, try and understand them as essentially as people, and it was and there's two sides to that. One is, of course, looking beyond the violence and trying to understand the totality of Scandinavian society at this time, but also while at the same time acknowledging that violence is an important force, not just in Viking Age Scandinavian society, but in the entire early medieval world. And so that's really kind of where the interest in topics such as slavery and raiding came about, because I think we have to try and develop a kind of a holistic understanding of the past, and so not just focusing on one aspect of the society that we might find particularly interesting or agrees with our values, but actually acknowledging the kind of the variety. As I say, that's the kind of the violent, the non-violent, the links between practices such as trading and conflict and raiding. Slavery is a really good example of that, because captives taken in during raids might be sold within a peaceful environment somewhere else. So yeah, it was really kind of just a process that grew organically over time.
Oh, fantastic! So you research a lot of these topics related to violence, the Viking Age, and martiality, and this is fantastic because one of the most interesting things that I know about the Viking Age is this topic related to the violence. And we can say that the Viking Age was a period that was dominated by this violence that we show in many aspects, like movies, series. What do we know about the violence in the Viking Age?
As I say, this is it, right? It's kind of it. I think we would deny it, but it kind of attracts people. We like something about this aspect of the Viking Age. But it's really important to emphasize that the societies of Viking Age or late Iron Age Scandinavia were they're no more violent than their contemporaries in Europe. Violence is part of life. Whether that's kind of interpersonal conflicts and feuds, state-sanctioned violence, ritual violence kind of it seeps through many aspects of life. But with that, I think, and it's partly as well a product of the historical sources. The way we're presented with these groups is because they are intrinsically violent at some level. But I think that's, again, really it's more of a case of what has was chosen to be presented and what subsequent historiography focused on for the most part. And I think we kind of when we don't think about the Viking Age really in these terms anymore. I would argue it's again more like a hangover of these stereotypes. But I think part of the reason that they were perceived as being so violent is because basically they were societies that were, or these groups, these Viking groups, they were not fully understood by their contemporaries. The people writing the historical record didn't understand how they operated, what their objectives were, because all they see are these people showing up and raiding and pillaging and whatever. And that's actually the kind of, that's apologies for that. That's actually a kind of a historical trope that we see throughout history. You know, when you have groups coming into contact with each other's, in many cases that can be violent contact, and so that becomes the focus of what people discuss. But as I say, you know, I think we've done many great things in the study of the Viking Age in the last, you know, almost a century. You know, we're really kind of trying to dig under these narratives and create a more holistic understanding of, and I would say more realistic understanding of the past.
And we can say that all things in the Viking Age was solved in the conflict. As example, we saw that the Vikings in some point are only living in this, how can I say, with people of other countries every time it's a conflicted event, or no, it's just in some periods that this occurred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what that's what gets recorded, right? I mean, there must have been countless non-violent interactions, you know, across Europe and further afield as well. We just don't hear about that because that's not, those events are not of interest to those writing history, of course. I mean, and I think again, this is kind of why we end up with this one-sided view that doesn't reflect reality. And when you look at the wider archaeological record in particular, I mean, over time you see, of course, all sorts of different ways in which Scandinavian groups coming into contact with others integrated with them, you know, learn to live alongside them. And of course, those already, you know, those other societies also learn to coexist and live with these incoming groups as well. So yeah, I think it's really, again, it's just kind of, a lot of this comes down to what was chosen to be recorded as part of history.
Oh, that's fantastic to know that. And it's interesting because we are very accustomed with this vision of from many medias that the Vikings and the Norse societies are living day by day in a violence mode, and every time they how can this when we talk people from other places, they are sometimes don't want to be closed, or they are sometimes how can I say, a group that have this sentimental for violence, but sometimes they have this side of peace, but the conflict change every time to that situations. And this is very interesting to saw that other sides of the Vikings in that point. And one of the most interesting things when they saw the Viking societies is the martiality and the use of the war and uses of the to be a warrior. What do you know about this side in the Viking Age? Every time war is a significant point for that people, or we have some other aspects that are very interesting to know that they use in day by day, and this is a part of this war or not?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you talk about the kind of, say, the way that these societies are presented, and I think it's, you say, I mean, war is a factor, but of course it's really important to remember, I think, that, you know, for example, in you know, as everywhere, I mean, these are societies, for example, are heavily regulated by law, and we know this because we can see the inaction of assembly sites and the thing that governs people at the regional level. And violence as part of that is heavily regulated. The ideas of what constitutes socially acceptable violence in the Viking Age differ with our own, I would say, moral imperatives. For example, there were, you could killing someone wasn't necessarily a crime. It's the way in which you did it which counted. But so yeah, I mean, to kind of to think about these societies as not kind of having the mechanisms to suppress violence and suppress warfare, I think would be is not representative. But war, of course, did happen, and it's must, I think, have been central to what we see happening in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. The emergence of regional kingdoms and rulers becoming ever more powerful. I mean, these kinds of transitions are not usually, they can be, but I would imagine these are not necessarily peaceful. They involve conflict. But at the same time, what we can't know, because this is a prehistoric society, as I say, it's why we call it the late Iron Age in Scandinavia, we really don't know much about how these processes played out. And I think while conflict was certainly a part of that, again, at the same time, I don't think we can reduce these processes to just being violence and warfare. They must have been negotiated, and there must have been very complex interactions between different parties over time as certain leaders aim to increase their power at the expense of others, and vice versa. So again, I think martiality is a big part of it, but this was very heavily regulated. How well that was regulated is another question, but there's so many things we actually cannot know, which again makes it very interesting from my perspective anyway.
And we can say that religion, it's an important element that make this martiality so being relevant for the Viking Age. We can say that this idea of the Valhalla, of being in the house of Odin, what we can say that this idea was a concept for that this it's important to die in battle. This is a reality, or
it's a really good question, isn't it? And because this is part of the Viking stereotype, going to Valhalla if you die in battle, and that being the thing that one would want to achieve. You would want to go and die in a horrific way, painful and bloody, so you could end up in the halls of the gods. And I mean, this doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, the surviving literary sources, of course, produced during the medieval period, but arguably echoing back to the Viking Age, do suggest that, of course, this was an important part of the pre-Christian cosmology. But at the same time, I mean, it's the vast majority of people didn't die this way, and many people lived out their lives to for the time relatively old age and passed away in their homes. And we see through the burial rite, I mean, there's all kinds of treatment of the dead, and there's treatment of the dead that we can infer as being very respectful, with a lot of care being invested in burials, which implies that to die not in a violent way wasn't a bad thing. But I think it is an interesting aspect of the pre-Christian psychology, that again, when we think about why these groups went out and they engaged in this overseas travel and raiding and warfare, if you do believe that dying in this way will take you to a positive afterlife, if that's what you want, then actually that may have created a certain mindset that facilitated this kind of activity. This is something Neil Price has written about, for example, and I think it's something that we do need to take seriously, even if it maybe wasn't quite so all-encompassing, again, as our stereotypes of the period would have us believe. I think, again, it is something that's real. And and it's something that needs to be unpacked further.
And we can say that many things of this stereotype of warrior was related to some aspect that of the vision of Christianity vision from the Vikings, that they only use the force for resolve some things. And what we can say that why this vision was created for to represent the Vikings?
Well, sorry, it's difficult to say, isn't it? I think this vision that we get, of course, it comes from places, you know, from people living in the British Isles, living in Europe, who are creating this historical record. And it's because, as we mentioned earlier, I mean, this is the context in which they come face to face with these Scandinavian groups. It's when diplomacy breaks down and there's violence, or it's when they show up and they're engaging in raiding. And so again, that's the kind of the thing that follows through the course of history. But if, for example, we look at the Christianization process in Scandinavia, moving into the late Viking Age, the kind of the narratives of these kind of early, you know, the Christian kings trying to unify Norway, trying to unify what is Sweden now. And of course, those are very bloody conflicts, you know, involving an awful lot of warfare periodically. So again, I don't think we can necessarily separate those two things. I just think that when we're dealing with the actions of Viking groups outside of Scandinavia, the thing that makes it into the sources primarily is this violent interaction, because, you know, that's what is of interest and consequence to those people producing the historical documents. And of course, you know, the obvious point being that, you know, many of the places that Vikings went and raided were church institutions. So, you know, for these monks, when you wake up and you see a fleet of ships coming right at you, yeah, I mean, that's how you're going to perceive these Scandinavian groups as you know, as intrinsically violent. So I think, you know, it's just important to acknowledge the different perspectives of these groups, and while it doesn't mean it's invalid, what we get through history is just a really kind of very much a one-sided view, because the societies of Scandinavia don't produce their own written sources, so we can only infer what we read from the outside.
And one of the most interesting things in this point is because we can say what we do, they consist the aspects of a warrior, because we saw many things in internet that say, oh, the 10 virtues of Odin, or if you want to be a Viking Age warrior, you need to have these aspects. And we know that these ideas are very contemporary ideas if compared to the Viking Age. And what is the idea behind to be a warrior in that time?
That's a really interesting question. It's one of the projects that I work on. We're really trying to get to grips with this question. I think the first thing to kind of recognize is that when we talk about what a warrior is, we're really kind of applying our own mentality to the past. One of the kind of interesting things, as far as we know, reading the sources, that the people of Viking Age Scandinavia didn't have a term that directly correlates with what we would today call the warrior. So when today we think of this as being a role that is, again, intrinsically violent, it's linked to the battlefield, it's linked to, you know, power. Of course, that's kind of, we're applying our own standards to the past. That said, it is an important part of what we might call being a warrior. But when my colleagues and I discussed this topic, we tried to think about not who was a warrior, but rather kind of what was the mentality of what we might call warriorhood, you know, like personhood, warriorhood. And the idea that you're building an identity that has a relation to conflict, martial activity, and violence, but it's communicated though in many different ways, on and off the battlefield. It's communicated through the way you look, the way you dress, the kinds of social contexts that you live in on an everyday basis. And so it's much more kind of diverse, again, from this kind of one-dimensional view of violence. But I think in many cases, being what we would today call a warrior, I mean, it was linked first and foremost to your social and economic status, because only certain people within society can dedicate enough, their time to training for warfare and participating in warfare and leading groups of warriors in raiding and warfare. So it's a social position as much as it's a role in society, if that makes sense. I'm not sure I'm explaining it very well, but but as I said, it's kind of something that extends across many spheres of interaction. It's not just one-sided. It's social, it's political, it's ideological as well. And we can kind of see this, I think, in the way that these warrior groups interact with the society around them. Warrior groups depend on the rest of the population to provide them with materials, to make weapons, to make armor. They rely on the population to produce those things, while at the same time they may offer protection from external threats. So it's very much is a dialogue between warrior groups and the wider population. They're not just kind of these small groups that live on their own and away from the rest of society. I mean, they are part of society. And obviously they have their own families. They have partners, they have children, they have extended kinship networks. I mean, they're part of the social network. And the work that we're trying to do is actually to really explore this idea and perhaps even reinforce it, that they, again, as much as sometimes we want to separate warriors as a discrete part of Viking Age society, they're not. They're actually very well, as much as we are integrated into our own communities, so are these warrior groups.
And we can say that have some principles that the Viking warriors have to follow. Example, we saw that in many scenes or in some aspects of, like an Assassin's Creed Valhalla example, have a scene in the trailer that Eivor don't kill a woman and his child and in her child, and this is very interesting because we can say that in some aspect that have some rules that to be a warrior have some honor of to be a warrior or not. They don't make distinction in many aspects. We need to fight for what to do and don't have some principles that you want to follow. What is to separate the idea of this concept of this warrior? Is a warrior that have an impulsion to do many things in the battle, or a warrior that has some compassion with some situations?
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually I've never played in that Assassin's Creed game, so I'm not familiar with that one particularly. But it's a good point to raise, and I think again we need to kind of balance our modern day perceptions of what we expect to be good conduct in warfare, and balance that with perhaps the quite brutal realities of the past. It's very difficult to say. I mean, I can imagine that many warrior groups like those today, I mean, actually, and a good example would be kind of, almost kind of like, organized crime families and biker gangs and whatnot. Meaningful comparisons have been drawn here in the past. That there are codes of conduct that one must, of course, follow. Most importantly, in relation to your own group, because that's what's important. Outsiders are maybe not so important, but there are codes of conduct on how one behaves. Of course, in the heat of combat or a raid or battle, whether one adheres to those codes, if they exist, is another question. And I think the narratives that we read Viking groups coming and raiding a settlement, killing the men, enslaving the women and the children. I mean, they are repeated, so they can be considered to some extent a trope, but I think they do reflect reality. And the reality of what happens within these contexts is extremely brutal. At least while, if there is actual pitched fighting taking place, or it's the chaos of an attack, I'm not sure that, to be honest, anyone would be safe. If women and children, for example, are not killed, there may be specific reasons for that, and of course we can imagine all kinds of sexual abuse, but also, as I said, captivity, enslavement, being sold overseas, because sometimes it seems that the primary objective of some of these raids is to take captives. So it's a side of the past we may not want to dwell upon too much, but I think it's a real one. The extent to which codes of conduct and honor fell into that, I really can't say. But one can presume that, again, these people are not stereotypes. They're not homogenous. They were individuals like you and I. Perhaps some people did operate in different ways, and some groups may have operated in different ways. But of course, it's very difficult to say.
And sometimes I listen some phrases like, "Oh, the Vikings are a society that have how can I say a rape culture in 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 the aspects of the martiality and of this." What we can say about this in the reality? We can say that this is part of being a Viking, or no? This is a concept that was created for what we can saw, that people saw in many aspects in the series that show the Vikings in the village being very violent and with the women and doing things that people can be shocked sometimes. What we know about this, a little about this idea?
I mean, it's warfare is something obviously we would rather didn't happen, and unfortunately, sexual violence as part of warfare has been going on potentially since warfare began, and it goes on today. So there's no reason to believe it was any different in the Viking Age. And of course, that is, as you said, it's kind of fed into the stereotype of what these Viking raiding groups were. But I think, as I say, as it has been throughout history, this was an aspect of it. It's maybe not necessarily even just targeting women. Children may have been especially vulnerable to this as well, of course. And when we look at the kind of the fates of captives and people who are being made enslaved, I mean, of course, the potential to be used as sexual objects, because once you become someone's legal property, of course, they, according to the law, can exercise their rights over your body. So, of course, this would have obviously been a potential danger for anyone who was unfortunate enough to be taken captive. Again, it's something that's been built into the kind of the stereotype of the Vikings, as it were. But again, it reflects reality, unfortunately, I think, to a real degree. Again, to what extent this was this took place in any context of violence, it's impossible to say. But unfortunately, I think it's something we do have to assume was regularized. Perhaps it was not perceived as unusual or unacceptable, socially unacceptable. This was part of what happened in conflict. Yeah, it's I say one of those unpleasant facts of the past and indeed a conflict in the present.
Yeah, this is interesting to analyze, because many people, when saw the aspects of the Vikings, the first image that they saw, it's a person that was very strong, person that was blonde and probably will do things very violent, like raping people, or they are killed people and doing these aspects. And this is very interesting to discuss because of to dissociate the idea they made that all people in that society do this, or all people that go to a Viking and doing this. And this is interesting to discuss. And we have an aspect in that society that of a war, that we have the Berserks and Wolfhedner. And we can say that they are part of the society as with their how can I say, the arm of the king, or they are a dissociate part of this principal army, or they are warriors that do things with their own concepts, with their own traditions and own rituals. What do you can say about this type of warriors?
They're really fascinating. There does seem to be this suggestion, and we see it in archaeological finds. We read it, of course, in the literary sources, that certain warriors or groups of warriors kind of did, and as you mentioned, I mean, they're often presented as kind of being somewhat elite, close to the king, or kind of as part of his personal retinue, through some kind of ritualistic association with the gods, namely Odin, that they did kind of take on these kind of animal traits during battle. And they would, maybe prepared themselves for this through participation in ritual practices or performances. And maybe there was a kind of ingrained belief that they would transform into predatory animals, bears or wolves, for example, as the names imply. And actually, I mean, one can see how, in certain contexts, this would make one very, well, it would increase one's efficiency in warfare if you're not worried about dying because you believe yourself to have taken on this persona. And as we mentioned earlier, if you do die, you're going to go to Valhalla anyway, so it doesn't matter. One can see why this would kind of, this would be beneficial for these groups to actually kind of engage in these practices. But yeah, they're an interesting type of warrior group because, of course, I mean, it's very difficult to kind of pull them kind of mythological associations and literary associations away from reality. But as I say, there are kind of archaeological finds indicating this kind of concept of shape shifting and taking on persona of animals in direct associations with conflict. So I like to think it is something real. But kind of the motivation, the psychology behind that is really difficult to get to. And this, again, is something I think we could really do with actually looking at from a perspective other than archaeology and history and literature. Actually, I think engaging with psychologists and trying to think about these processes that go on in people's brains would be really kind of useful and illuminative in this context.
And just for end this part about martiality in the Viking Age, you can say that all aspects in the Viking Age are related in some point to this idea of the martiality is part of our life, but have an idea that is just much more for a part of a group in that society. In can I say in the high status levels in that society is more. This is more. How can I say? Is more cultivated by these people. We can say that because I don't think that farmers thinking much more in war compared to this part of society. What you can say about that?
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, most people during this period were subsistence farmers. They were much more concerned with getting a good harvest. But I think actually though that and we see this again, I think in some of the literary sources, if there were opportunities to participate in martial activity, people did take them, because obviously if you can leave your farm and go away for a couple of months and come back with all kinds of wealth, that's going to do a lot for you in terms of not only your kind of economic position but your social position. So I like to think of like kind of there being kind of part-time Vikings who kind of took advantage of opportunities that were offered by these kind of more established warrior groups. But there is also evidence going from the earlier Scandinavian law codes, which is from the medieval period, that was certain the freeborn population was kind of to an extent responsible for maintaining a state of defensive readiness, to be able to defend their communities, defend their region against external threats, and that included maintaining weapons, owning weapons. So at the same time, while the life of most of the population was not geared towards conflict, I think again it was something that they lived with and had to be prepared for, whether that was to take advantage of an opportunity or to defend yourself against attack. So I think there's kind of different layers of martial participation that we can think of in terms of Viking Age society. But yeah, for most people, let's say kind of bringing in the harvest is your primary concern on a yearly basis.
Yeah, this is interesting because we saw many aspects that's difference in these groups, that the group that want more related to the Belgic society or this army society is much more related to sometimes an elite or some aspects of the high society of that Viking Age. And we saw these other that were more related to say a work that was related to the maintenance of the house, or how can I say, like the farmers that have more related to this cultivating of his own food. And this is a very different activities that differences of this martial idea. And this is very interesting to analyze because the elites thinking much more in war that we can saw, and we can say that they think the idea of being a warrior, being much more closer to the rituals of Odin. And I think this is causing much more these people with this compared to farmers that I think have cults much more in Freya or the other gods, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that kind of Odin seems to be the kind of the patron of the elite. I mean, again, I mean, it sounds like a weird thing to say, but I mean, like, violence serves a purpose in societies, and especially for certain groups. And I think being able to associate yourself with this powerful god, and to be able to have the influence to command people, to engage in conflict, and to be successful in that. Yeah, I mean, that's it's a package of activities and a package of ideas, which, as you say, is different probably to many other people, as say, who would have different ideological concerns. Their violence is not the center of what they're trying, where their kind of their prosperity, as it were, lies. So I think that's actually really you put it in a really good way.
Yeah. And one of the most parts that I think was very interesting to comprehend the Viking Age is, I think it is one of the parts that many people sometimes don't, how can I say, give it much more attention for that part. And I think is the market of slavery in the Viking Age. And what is the idea of being a slave in the Viking Age? Because we have many ideas that, how can I say, that show us to see that they do activities in the house and the principal houses of the family, or they are sold in the markets, or what is the idea behind of the slavery in the Viking Age?
Mhm. I think it is kind of clear. I think we can say, safely, that there were a group within society that we would today describe as being enslaved, and they could be born into slavery, obviously in Scandinavia itself. But as we also see in the historical record, there does seem to be a practice of taking captives overseas and perhaps selling them overseas. However many people were brought back to Scandinavia, I think, is an interesting question in itself. But what it really comes down to is, as in many other slaveholding societies, is that there is this group within the social spectrum who can be legally considered as property. And that means they have very few and restricted, what we might today call rights, like civil rights. The people who claim ownership over them have the power to direct their actions, to use their bodies, to use their labor. And I mean, this is the sad story of enslaved people throughout history. And within the Viking Age context, of course, we see this class of people who of course, we also use the term thralls, as being engaged in all of the sorts of activities that we would associate with enslaved people in other contexts. So, as you say, it's kind of working in agriculture, as the hard labor, menial labor, also working within the household as something more aligned to what we might today call a domestic servant. Also being taken, though, perhaps as marriage partners, or entering into or being entered into relationships with their captors. So it's a very kind of, while on one hand it's a very definable group in society, this is also a very diverse one. And I don't think we should assume that the identities of any thrall were the same as any other. They're human beings like us, with their own kind of ways of navigating their conditions, navigating their circumstances. And there is evidence, for example, from again the earlier Scandinavian law codes, but also a kind of couple of runic inscriptions from Sweden and Denmark, also from the late Viking Age, to suggest that some individuals could achieve a lot of social mobility. They can move through the social spectrum in ways that we might not expect. So and we don't know enough about slavery in the Viking Age. It's something myself and many other scholars now are actually working on. I think but it's an institution that we do need to understand better, because it's we can argue about the size of the enslaved population, but what is clear is that they are very visible in the eyes of contemporary society. They are there, and they're being engaged in a whole range of tasks which are essential to the daily operation of communities. So trying to understand that better, I think, is really a kind of a key priority if we want to understand the kind of the total social structure of the period. And we're starting to get there, I think. It's a long process.
Yeah, it's interesting because we saw that the ideas of a treatment for these people and to these people, and it's just because we have these two sides and the visions that they bring to ideas, because we have ideas like a bad treatment for to these people, and example, we have the movie like Northman that shows treatment for slaves, that treatment that give us the idea of people that was very negligent by people that was in the high status, and people that see they like only like people just for working in that community. And we have an idea that I saw that was very interesting, that was bring by Vinland Saga, in that some point the Thorfinn that is a shelter that was treated sometimes very well by his owner. And what you can say about these aspects of the treatment of slavery in the Viking Age? We can say that they are treated very bad, or sometimes they are treated like part of a family. What is the idea and the concept of this in the Viking Age?
Yeah, I think we can start in a way with the Eddic poem Rigtula, right? That says it describes the social structure of Viking Age society, and within this social structure, the thralls are a very defined group. And in describing the kind of the lives and tasks of these individuals, I mean, they're engaged in menial labor, hard labor, and the names that they have actually kind of reflect the fact that they're disfigured, they've suffered from injuries, which does imply, they're harsh treatment. But at the same time, I mean, and undoubtedly this was the case. I can only believe in any society where you have enslaved people. But at the same time, I mean, and Stefan Brink has pointed this out, I think, quite well. I mean, every individual in society, no matter whether they're the highest, what we might call the highest status or the lowest status, you are part of a network, you're part of a group. And so when you're taken into a household, even as an enslaved person, you do become a member of that network. And while you are obviously exploited in various ways, the slaveholder actually, they depend on you for your labor. They depend on that exploitation, and they also have to kind of sustain you. You have to be fed, you have to be clothed, you have to be sheltered. So it's kind of it's a kind of a weird social position of being part of the household, but also being outside of it. And I think that kind of actually, I think it's actually quite a good way of encapsulating the position of enslaved people cross-culturally. You're on the kind of border of inclusion and marginality, which means the conditions that you might face on a daily basis could change. I mean, as you point out, I mean, if you had certain skill sets, and we have to accept the likelihood, of captives and enslaved people developing real relationships, emotional relationships with the slaveholders. And of course, that all feeds into this social dynamic. But I think the main thing to perhaps emphasize is how unstable that dynamic is. I don't think you would be able to know from one day to the next almost how you're going, how you're going to be treated, how you're going to fare. And I think that's again kind of a part of this being included and marginalized. It's this idea that life is, there's no constant, there's no security. And of course, I mean, that has its own implications for how one, acts and views the world. And but I think that's why it's really so difficult to kind of tie down the identities of the enslaved, because they likely varied across communities, within communities, and the identity of any individual, their status and their roles could potentially change quite rapidly. Which again is what makes it what actually makes it in a way so interesting.
And we can say that in some aspects that slaves that come from another parts of the world, we can say that is they absorb in some point the aspects of the Viking Age culture, or what is the ideas of behind this. We have sometimes aspects that I saw in the Viking series, that when Athelstan is captured, in some point he passing for a transition that they become part of the Viking Age society. What you can say about this idea?
I mean, at this point, it's entirely theoretical and speculative, to be honest, because of course we don't have these narratives from the period. But I think if you look cross-culturally, you see when captives are brought into a community, as we've just mentioned, their fates can vary wildly. But I think when we're considering, if we're talking about captives being brought from overseas into Scandinavia, I think there's a lot of factors that could come into play here. I mean, of course, you are an outsider within the community, and that's not just potentially the way you look, your hair color, your eye color, or and of course the language you speak. So there has to be an integration process, I guess, over time, where you kind of learn to be able to communicate with your captors. And one would presume that you also, I mean, because you are clothed, housed, fed by your captors, you take on their, in material terms, their cultural traits quite quickly because you have none of your own. But at the same time, I think that would be a bit reductive to think in that way. Because we see, for example, in the very end of the Viking Age and moving into the Middle Ages, it's been argued by Mats Rosland that in southern Sweden we see a kind of a surge in the production of foreign pottery from the Baltic, and he argues that this is actually foreign captives being brought to Scandinavia, and they're actually recreating kind of pottery forms that are familiar to them from their homeland, and that then spreads, within communities within Scandinavia. And if that's correct, I think that's a really good example of how actually captives can actually alter their captors' society in their own ways. And although I have always wondered, and this is always was made complicated by the Viking series, but obviously, I mean, if you're bringing captives from continental Europe or Britain and Ireland, there's an ideological difference there, a religious difference, and whether for some people in Scandinavia, their first interactions with Christianity were through captive peoples, who come from a different place and have very different beliefs on the world to you. And again, of course, we never be able to say. But we do see this, for example, in the life of Ansgar. When he comes to Birka in the 9th century, there's in Birka there's a whole Christian community, a captive community who are Christians, and they're all happy because they can worship their own God in their own way again. So it does imply that there is actually kind of there's this process is in some way contributing to a fusion of cultures. But it's as I say, it's we can only really speculate on that. It's a really interesting topic, though. It's something I think about quite a lot.
Yeah, have a lot of interesting things about this topic. And for my last question, I would like to know, we can say that have some ideas of that the slave have some of pattern that how can I say, have a type of to choice. Oh, the slave will be served to some activity, or this slave need to be this activity, and he will do this activity, she does activity like that. It have this idea of distribute some activities in this for every time of people. We can say that.
I think it's what you say makes sense logically. I think some people did end up in this situation where they would be doing certain tasks and others doing others. Of course, it's incredibly difficult to get at, either archaeologically or through the use of text. But I think we can start to conceptualize this where we think about the kinds of contexts where we might expect to find enslaved people, if that makes sense. So it's been argued, for example, that in a Viking Age household, you might have people, if you have a farm with animals, we might look to where the animals are being housed, the byres, because in some cases in the late Iron Age, you find evidence to almost suggest that there's people living in these byres with the animals. And one might then infer from this that those would perhaps be enslaved people. They're not given sleeping quarters in the house, they live out with the animals. On the other side, though, we may have people who live within the household, work within the household on a daily basis. But that's in a way even more difficult, because trying to, identify where they were working or where they were sleeping is incredibly difficult, because they might sleep in the corner, of one of the rooms. It's really difficult to be able to identify these contexts specifically. But I think we can afford to speculate in an informed way. And through that, I think it is, and again, I think, especially if we utilize kind of cross-cultural perspectives on slavery, we can maybe try and define, at least theoretically, these kinds of different roles that people might have played. And we can keep those in mind when we're trying to study this practice during the Viking Age, because, as I said, I think to an extent we have to assume that enslaved people are there in many different contexts. And when we allow ourselves to do that, then we can start to think about, okay, so if they're there, how are they there? What are they doing? But it's very much an exercise in thought rather than actually doing archaeology.
And what is the ideas behind the use of slaves in the sacrifice? What they have some significance for doing this? Why this is have this practice of the use of the slaves in the sacrifice?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because of course this idea derives, I would say, from actually mainly from a couple of written sources where we see the killing of enslaved people in funerary contexts, and even Fadlan and the Rus funeral on the Volga. That's the really famous one. But there is a corpus of burials from across Scandinavia. It's not a large one, but there is a corpus of burials where we do have multiple individuals in the grave. And in specific cases, we have individuals who've been treated very differently to others within the grave. So you might have one individual who appears to be buried with care, and then you have another one or more individuals who may have been, in some cases, it looks like they've been decapitated or just thrown into the grave. Or indeed, in one case from the Mella Valley, they've been deposited on top of a cremation pyre. So that's after the funeral. These people have been killed and thrown on top. And we have to ask, why, what is special about these people? And I think we're kind of drawn, because of these literary sources and historical sources that we have, we're drawn naturally to this assumption that they must be enslaved people. And I mean, it's of course it's a good interpretation. I think I think it's very valid, but I think it's also important to be open to alternatives. We don't need to assume that they're enslaved people. There could be people selected for any reason to participate in these activities. I mean, maybe there's even processes why people volunteer to be included in these processes. I don't know if that's the case. It's just something we have to potentially account for. But yeah, I mean, trying to prove, empirically that these people are enslaved is a really it's a difficult task. It might help, as we see in some cases, if they appear to have had their hands or their feet bound. It implies they're being restrained when they're killed and placed in the grave. Some of my colleagues have attempted to look at the diet of these individuals, whether they subsisted on what we might consider to be a lower status diet to others in the cemetery or in the burial. But those results, again, I mean, they can be interpreted in numerous ways. And so while I think this, if we're to believe the sources, and I think there is good reason to, this was a practice, I think we need to be careful in assuming that everyone we encounter in the archaeological record is the same. But it's been argued that enslaved people might be killed to accompany the dead to the afterlife. Why? I'm not quite sure. Why would you want one of these people? Are they there to serve you in the afterlife? But if that's the case, why do you want a decapitated enslaved person? What are they going to do? But it could be some other kind of, I hate to use the word, but offering to the gods or something like that, a kind of a sacrifice, as it were. But again, it's very difficult to say. And it's, I think we need to really focus on these burials and contextualize them, I think, more widely with the wider kind of burial context, because late Iron Age, Viking Age burials are incredibly varied at the best of times. So we need to really think, what is special about these individuals within this context, and then really start to work from there. But as I say, I think it's a valid interpretation. It's certainly one you can't just dismiss. But I like to think there's a lot more there to be discovered than what we know so far.
Oh, that's fantastic. Mr. Raffield, I would like to thank you so much for doing this interview. It was fantastic. We learned a lot about the idea of martiality and slavery in the Viking Age. Do you have some tips of books that you wanted to recommend for the audience of the channel for learning more about these topics?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, you're familiar with it. Neil Price's Children of Ash and Elm gives an excellent overview of the Viking Age in general. But for discussions of slavery, for example, there's Stefan Brink's book Thraldom. I can grab it there. Which is a excellent book if you've not come across it. There's also a recent edited volume, Toplak, Othus, and Simek, Viking Age Slavery. And Janelle Fontaine in the UK has quite literally just brought out a book about slavery in early medieval Europe, which I haven't read yet myself, but it's on my to-buy list. And I know Janelle, and she does excellent work. So if you look her up, I'm sure that would be an excellent book to read. And yeah, those would be my recommendations right now. But there's so much information out there, and these days, it's a really good thing. Scholars are publishing more open access. There's so much free literature out there. So looking through Google Scholar or something like that, I'm sure anyone can, you can find the latest research and hopefully be able to access it. But if not, as I always say to everyone, email the authors if there's something an academic paper you want, because they're almost always more than happy to share it. So I would recommend that to everyone.
Oh, thank you so much. These books are fantastic. One of them I read, and this is amazing books. Thank you so much for advising the channel about that. I will just stop the recording.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.